Okay, today I want to talk a little bit about pigment. I am not going to do a whole color theory class or anything like that, but these are just, I guess, some things that as a beginner, I kind of have wished I had known or realized, I guess. So every paint has a pigment. Most of your pigments are going to be labeled things like PY for yellow, PR for red, PO for orange, that kind of thing. So we know that certain colors will always have that number. So Hansa Yellow Light is PY35. So if you have a mix that has PY35, you know that they have used Hansa Yellow Light. Some things are like well known, I guess is the word I want. Things like phthalo blue, for instance, is used a lot in lots of color. So it's usually PB15. So if you see PB15 in one of your paints, you know that's a phthalo blue. And the important part of that is once you know how phthalo blue reacts in certain situations, then you can kind of know how that mix is going to react too. So phthalo blue typically has a pretty good salt reaction. It typically blooms very well in water. It's a pretty strong blue, so its tinting strength is very, very good. So knowing those things will help you sometimes when you're reading things and you're like, well, is this the same as the color I already have? So just getting familiar with these pigments it's just really useful. By no means is it absolutely necessary, but it is useful. It will also tell you a lot of times if your paint is going to be toxic, because there are certain things that are always toxic. So for instance, your cobalt, your cadmiums, your manganese, your chromiums, there's something else I want off the top of my head that I can't remember. Those are always going to be toxic colors. So you have to be careful with them. Obviously, we're not eating them, we're not drinking them, so I feel like it's not too big of a deal for most of us, but if you have kids or pets that can potentially get into your paints, that can be an issue if you're doing something where you're sanding behind it or you're putting particles up in the air that you might breathe in. That's also an issue. So having just even a basic idea of some of these can be very helpful for you. So I just think that understanding some basics of the pigments is really helpful. I found this chart online. I will see if I can remember to link it for you, and then you can color it or you can print it yourself. Sorry, I'm seeing colors and now I'm off on my own thing. I have squirrel brain because I have ADHD. But it is a very helpful thing, and it'll also sometimes break it down. Like this chart will break it down that you know that this is a color that Winsor and Newton uses or whatever. So that is a useful little chart to have. But I also want to talk a little bit about naming, and well, let's stick with pigments for a second. So pigments are very different, but the thing with pigments is that so these two colors, this is Opera Pink and I think Quinacridone Lilac. So these are two very obviously different colors, right? They don't really look alike. But if you look at this, you're going to see that they're actually both PR 122. So these pigments are technically the same pigment. They are just mixed differently, and that's how we get those different colors a lot of times. So whatever they have done with the Opera Pink has actually made it a fugitive color, and fugitive means that it is not very light fast. It's going to fade. It's not going to hold up. It's not something you want to use on a painting you're going to hang on the wall or something that's going to see a lot of sunlight, because it's going to fade. Whereas this Quinacridone Lilac is also PR 122 and the light fast rating on it is very good. Sometimes those light fast ratings are a little sketchy. I know that Daniel Smith says that I think Moon Glow is light fast, but you know, people testing it say that it's definitely not. So, you know, there's a difference in the colors sometimes, when even though they're the same, like these are both PR 209. They're actually very similar colors. They're both quinacridone colors, which are some of my favorites. So that family tends to be really good, very light, fast, that kind of thing. And that's another thing when you start learning pigments and you look at something and you're like, oh, well, this is a quinacridone color. They're usually pretty good about these things. But they're both PR 209. And while they're very similar, they are a little different in shade. This one leans a little pinker. This one's definitely a little more red. So they are a little different. These are swatch cards that I've been making. I'm going to set up a little index card so that I have all my information close at hand. That way I know, you know, about the staining and the granulation and how well it blooms, if it's got a salt reaction on it, and I'll also know if they're toxic or not. And that information will be readily available to me. So I've spent a lot of time making swatch cards lately. So the other thing is that just because a color is called the same thing, you're going to find a lot of differences between brands in a lot of cases. So these are both technically sepia. This one I believe is it's Winsor Newton sepia, and this one is actually Holbein sepia. And yes, they're similar, but they're very different feels. This Winsor Newton to me is a much cooler shade. It's a much heavier, blacker shade. In fact, when I got it, I was in my head, I was like, this isn't sepia like I'm thinking of it, because normally I think of sepia as very warm. This is much closer to the sepia I'm usually thinking of. So they're very different, and they have different formulations. So if you come over here, Winsor Newton's is PR 101, so you know it's a red, it's a black. I think PR 101 is actually iron oxide, if I remember correctly, and so that's how they have created theirs. Over here on the Holbein, I don't know which one it is. Holbein, I think, is how I usually hear it. This one is Pigment Brown 7 and Pigment Black 6. So they both share that Pigment Black 6, but the rest of it is very different, and they do create different colors. So a lot of times if you hear somebody, oh, I really love sap green's a big one I hear all the time. Oh, sap green. And then I got one and I was like, wow, I really dislike this color. And it's probably just that brand that I don't like. Olive green is not a color I use a lot, but it is a color that I do like to have on hand because it does come in handy. I think it was the Daniel Smith olive green, and I was like, wow, I really don't like this color. But I bought the Winsor Newton olive green, and it was exactly what I was looking for. Off the top of my head, I don't remember how their pigments break down, but just know that sometimes the color will vary between brands. Now, that said, there are certain colors, phthalo blue, I feel like most of your phthalos are pretty close across the board. Not always exact, but pretty similar. There's another one that I was trying to think of. It'll dawn on me, but you know, some of the manganese blue, I think I have 3 different versions of it, and they're all almost identical. So I can interchange those without any issue. But it does vary. Some of these pigments do change, and the formulations aren't always the same. So, you know, have a look at how they swatch out and see which one you really like. In another video, I'm going to talk about dot cards, which I find immensely helpful. Those sometimes will help me weed out, you know, hey, I really don't like this version of this color, but I like the other one. So just know that they can be very different across manufacturers. So in this case, this is a Viridian. So they're pretty similar overall, but you can see that this one reacts very differently to salt than this one did. And that, you know, depending on what effects you're trying to get may make a difference for you. So if they granulate, if they bloom well in water, those kinds of things can change manufacturer to manufacturer. So in this case, this is a Winsor Newton Viridian. This is an M. Graham Viridian. So M. Graham does not bind their paints with gum arabic the way most companies do. They actually bind their stuff with honey. So I have found that they do react a little differently sometimes. But if you look at their formulations, these are completely wildly different. This is just pigment green 18. This one is 3 different pigments. So how they react and how they will mix sometimes can really be affected by the pigments, especially when you've got multi-pigment colors. That can really throw off your color. If you're like, oh, I just need a simple green, and you start, you know, grabbing stuff, you may end up with something funky because you've got a mix of colors that doesn't quite work together, or they cancel each other out. So also think good things to know in this case, that this M. Graham has some toxicity to it. So that's something I want to know. Again, for me personally, it's probably not going to be an issue, but for some people, it very potentially could. I don't have kids, so they're not getting into it. I have had some paints fall and get chewed on by dogs, and had a little bit of a heart attack and had to stop and look it up and see if it was toxic or not, which is one more reason I'm going to do my big swatch cards. And when I do those, I'll show you. But it really does change a lot of times manufacturer to manufacturer, and I'm not saying any of them are right or wrong or better than the others. All of this is just preference in the end, and your style and what you want to accomplish and the look you're going for and that kind of thing. So, you know, even though these have different formulations, they're still a pretty similar color. They're not the exact same, but you could probably interchange them color-wise. But if you wanted to do a painting that you needed a good salt reaction on, then you're going to want to go with this one. So things like that, like I said, just can be important. Another one that varies widely between brands a lot of times is Payne's Gray. A lot of these will lean much more blue. Some of them will lean a little more gray or black. So, you know, that's just a preference. I tend to like mine to lean a little bluer. So sometimes I will have one and I'll mix up a little bit and just put a little bit of indigo in it if I need it to go a little more blue. But in this case, if you look, this is Daniel Smith. It is non-toxic, which is good to know. It's PB Black, so it's black 29, or excuse me, blue 29 and black 9. But this is the Holbein. It's black 6, black 15, and PR 122, excuse me, blue 15 and PR 122. So they have added a red in theirs to change things up. So they're all Payne's Gray, but they're different Payne's Grays. So this Daniel Smith on the swatches definitely leans a little more blue than the Holbein one does, but you could tweak this Payne's Gray to make it what you want. Me personally, I'm not a huge fan of mixing all my colors. I would rather just have the colors. I know that's not an option for everybody. I am lucky enough to live next to a pretty good art store with reasonable prices, and I am now a paint hoarder, but that definitely helps me get the ones that I need. I know not everybody has that luxury, and if you just really like to mix paints for colors, that's awesome. It's not something I like to focus on. I'd much rather, like I said, just have the color. I don't mind tweaking a color. Like, I don't mind tweaking this a little more blue or a little more gray if need be, but I don't want to create a color as a general rule. It's just not my thing. So these are just some things to think about when you're getting into painting. And I mean, this applies to watercolor and oils and everything else too, to know your pigments and know how they react, and you know what you're going to get, and the things that, you know, if they're very heavily tinting pigments, then you know that they can easily overpower certain pigments that are less tinting to them. So it's good information to have. It's certainly not critical, you know, to paint if you just want to paint. But it is interesting to see the different formulations and the fact that they often come up a lot differently, in how they appear, and even like their different reactions to, you know, salt or the water or something like that. Like looking at these two swatch cards, this one looks like it travels just a hair better and has a little bit more of a salt reaction, but it could be just a little extra water down here that did it. So, you know, just knowing those differences can really change how your painting feels, or the color that you get, or, you know, if you are trying to mix and, you know, you don't realize, oh, hey, you know, phthalo blue will take over anything it touches if you've got something that's not quite as strong. You know, you need a good, I think lemon yellow is a pretty strong yellow. If you want a very vibrant green, then, you know, your lemon yellow and your phthalo blue are going to give you a pretty good green kind of thing. But if you try to put that in with another yellow, then you may end up with a kind of a muddy green, because those colors aren't going to mesh very well. So, like I said, I'm not going to dive into color theory or get really detailed into pigments, because I think that there's so many other channels that do that, you know, talk about a lot of mixing and stuff. But I just wanted to show some of those differences, and the fact that, you know, hey, this is all PR 122, but they're a very different color, and they will have different properties, you know, or hey, Payne's Gray is not necessarily just Payne's Gray no matter what. They are going to vary by manufacturers, and even how they're bound. Like I said, to me, the honey, it reacts a little different, and it does give it a little different feel and color, I feel like. And I haven't used a lot of the M-gram, but I have used some of them, and I just feel that that's how they are, with the honey, as opposed to the gum arabic. But you know, just like I said, knowing how these work and how they work together, and you know, the differences that can happen across manufacturers, even if they're using the same pigment, you may end up with a different color. So there's a lot that goes into it. I am glad I do not have to think about it and formulate stuff, because my poor little squirrel brain would probably explode. But again, good information to have. Like I said, I will try to remember to link this chart for you guys, and you can print it out if you really want to have a list of the pigments that are available. And then I will probably do this and make some notes about, you know, some tinting strengths and some other stuff, you know, just to have on hand. Definitely mark the toxic ones, because those can be an issue. There's also a lot of pigments that we do not have anymore. They're either not available, we've exhausted the source, or they've been deemed to be too unsafe, and in some cases, so things like cadmium, you're going to see a lot of times the true cads, they're toxic, but if you see a cadmium color that's a hue, then that is another pigment that they have used to recreate that cadmium color without the toxicity usually. So, you know, like I said, these things do come into play in your painting, and they're, at least to me, interesting to know. So if you had questions about pigments or didn't quite understand, you know, why your colors weren't the same across different companies, then I hope that helped to explain some of it. And again, if you have any questions, by all means, please let me know. I will try to answer them as best I can. All right, guys.